This is Making Better Decisions. I'm your host, Ryan Sullivan. Decisions are where rubber meets the road for organizations. Each week, we'll be learning from people who are on the front lines of turning raw data into better outcomes for their organizations. This show is sponsored by Canopy Analytic, helping companies make better decisions using data. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Today's guest is a highly experienced and accomplished leader with over a decade and a half of experience in leveraging data to drive business growth, has experience in both the finance and consulting industries, has used his data, finance, and technology expertise to create a proven track record of large-scale problem solving. Please welcome Senior Director of Analytics for Global Finance at Schneider Electric, Divya Malhan. How's it going?
Hey Ryan, thank you. Thank you so much for the brilliant introduction. Thank you.
Yeah. We like to gas everybody up, get you nice and excited before we get going.
Yeah, I wish everybody had a hype squad like you, man.
Thanks. I love it. Okay, so I want to get right in and ask you the same kickoff question that we ask everybody. What is the one thing you wish more people knew about using data to make better decisions?
That's a good one to start off with. And what I think people need to focus a little bit more on is not to get too bogged down with having the perfect data. See, at the end of the day, it is about making decisions, right? Uh, we need data for decisions, and depending on what you want to do, you're never going to have 100% or a complete data set that you need to make the perfect decision, right? So what we need to know is, how do we make it good enough? Because when we are in in the today's business environment, things need to move really, really fast, right? And there's a lot of time where we see that how quickly you react to things is better than making the perfect decisions, right? So that, in that sense of innovation, doesn't need to slow down for the perfect data. And that's what I think people need to keep in mind.
Yeah, I love that. You know, when I first started my career, um, I was doing financial performance and analysis, or FP&A for all of those finance pros in the know. And that was kind of one of the things that I was really struck by is there's this concept of total optimization that took me a little time to learn. So when I started, it's kind of like, all right, well, I'm focused on this piece of the puzzle. How can I make this the most optimal possible? But it's like if the amount of time, effort, and energy that it takes me to optimize this is less than the return that I get, well, then I should just not do that. And so it's, as you mentioned, kind of really thinking about the bigger picture. And if you're in a landscape where speed is much more valuable than, one unit of speed is more valuable than an incremental unit of accuracy, well, that's a good decision. And that's not something that you hear very often in the data world, right? Like there's this assumption that every piece of data needs to be 100% accurate, right? So it's really thinking about the business goals and the trade-off with all of that stuff. I think that one of the things that a lot of organizations interact with is this idea of figuring out which of those things are important. So, what advice would you give to an organization to try and figure out, okay, well, what is the right amount of effort that we should put into this to make sure that it's as accurate as it needs to be, but is also getting out the door quickly enough?
Yeah, so again, I think what we as data professional and what organizations focus on already, and should continue to focus on, is data quality, right?
Mm,
And data quality depends on your use case. The same data may be a bad quality data for a particular use case, and it may be a good quality data for another use case, right?
mm,
For looking at, you know, uh, a business performance, we look at highly aggregated numbers, right? It doesn't matter if couple of records in there, and you've been in FP&A the level, if the errors are below the level of materiality, it doesn't matter. But
Mhm.
the same use case for the same data set, if you're using the same data set to send out letters to your customers to get back the money, if you do not have the right records there, even there's a minor difference in the balances, the same data then becomes the bad quality data, right? So what needs to be focused on is making sure that organizations have the right quality of data for the use case that they are aiming for. And for each one of them, there would be at some point diminishing returns in getting the perfect data set.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely love that. And those were also I would argue kind of perfect examples for it, you know? Um, so one of the things that is really interesting about getting to do the podcast is I get to talk to people with a lot of different types of backgrounds. And, obviously the common thread is that everybody's kind of, a data professional believes in the value of data, has, certain technical aptitude to be able to create or understand analytics. I also love digging into the things that everybody is different on. So one of the things that I think you really bring to the table, is that kind of consulting and financial background. So what would you say are some of the unique aspects of generating, financial reporting? And what are some of the challenges and the things that are different about financial reporting versus any other type of reporting?
Oh, how it is different, I'd have to probably give it a thought. But some of the things that I think are absolutely essential in financial reporting is trust. Somebody
Mm,
who's looking at your financial reports, whether it is within inside the organization for your performance metrics or outside the organization for your statutory reporting, trust is the central pillar. So anything that you say in a financial report needs to be backed uh, by an auditable record of whatever you're saying.
mm,
That is one. The second thing I think that which is really really essential is to make it really easy for people to understand, right? As we as if we delve into different types of reporting for different people, uh, it can end up being very technical and niche to a particular subject area. And especially when we talk about financial numbers or financial reports, they're used by all types of people, right? Uh, Outside the finance organization, within a company, within an organization as well. I'll give you an example. Uh, I think a few years ago, maybe like 7, 8 years ago, uh, I went into a meeting with a business VP and his entire staff, and we were discussing financial performance. And I started talking about, okay, here's the forecast. This is how far we are from our target. And as I read the room, I could feel like there's like something missed, like, that suddenly everybody was very quiet. So I just asked, like, hey, do you understand what I'm talking about? Because I'm right now talking about forecast and target, and these are two different things. And then we came to a point where everybody was like, we don't really understand this. And I
mm.
went into that meeting thinking about, oh, these are business people. They must be talking about these numbers every single day. So I was going into that meeting with my own bias that everything that I talk about in finance is going to be understandable by every person. So I think keeping it simple in finance to understanding that it is going to be viewed by people who do not understand finance is important. So going back, I think trust is really important in financial reporting.
Mm.
Auditability is really important. And the third thing is making it simple and understanding that people beyond the finance world are also going to look at it.
Yeah, I love all of those answers. one of the things that I think is kind of interesting is like the intersection of those last two things that we've talked about. So obviously within the finance space, particularly like when generating financials for a publicly traded company or any company that really has material investment in it, there are, demands for high fidelity and for, supporting documentation like you talked about. There may even be, in the case of publicly traded companies, SOX compliance that people, there's all of this additional work and kind of red tape and governance and compliance stuff. How do you balance the requirements of all of that with the speed and the need to change quickly that you've talked about?
Uh, uh, so I think where it comes down to building trust is basically, okay, let me start over on this one.
Sure.
Speed is important when it comes down to innovation, right? Business decisions, keeping things going. But when it comes down to financial reporting, I would primarily categorize it into two ways, right? One that you do as part of your performance management, and the second one where you're doing it for statutory purposes. The statutory
Mm,
purpose is, you have external auditors working with you on those reports that you're publishing for your external stakeholders. It's a standardized process. On the performance management or your internal financial reporting that must be doing, that we do to different business leaders, etc. The speed is key, and again, we come down to making things highly standardized, right?
mm,
To give you an example uh, from my own work that we've done in the past couple of years now, we were at a point where a new standard report, it would take us somewhere between 2 to 3 months to build it and then distribute it across the organization to the point where we are now doing the same reports in almost 2 weeks or so. And this shortening of the time period has been because of how we have standardized the whole process, how we have put in a lot of effort at the back end in the quality of data that is being generated, and how we have basically developed this big uh, financial data warehouse that we can rely upon to quickly generate new insights. So I think it
mm.
it eventually comes down to overall data maturity of an organization to be able to leverage and harness that data quickly.
Yeah. From I've had the opportunity to work with, small and large financial institutions, funds, to a lot of different areas of finance, whether it's, you know, a business whose primary business is not finance, but obviously everyone has to do finance, or it's an organization that does some type of financial work as their bread and butter. And one of the things that I have found about finance is that it's one of the areas where almost everybody has the data mindset, because you kind of have to, right?
Yeah.
It's a very numerically based field, and most of what we're doing, we're talking about, records and transactions and things like that. Like the bread and butter of finance really is data. And one of the other things that you find is obviously, you know, when it comes down to dollars, things matter a lot, So like that demand of very high fidelity and accuracy, and can we trace and explain everything, has kind of put us in a situation where, like the lifeblood of finance is the manually generated Excel document, right? For better or for worse, right? There are some places where people have, as you talked about, like moved into, areas of higher data maturity and are starting to use things like a more complete data warehouse. And, but even still, then it's kind of like, all right, well, I'm going to dump that, out of, some whatever system I have it into an Excel doc. And then I'm going to like tick and tie out to somebody else, like
Yeah.
there's a lot of that going on. So I understand where that comes from. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's a good thing that everybody wants to make sure the financial numbers are accurate. That's a
Yeah,
really, really
yeah,
good thing. But if there's somebody out there who says, "Hey, this process that I'm working on, it feels repetitive. Like we know that it needs to be standardized and we know that it needs to be explainable, but that doesn't mean that it needs to be manual. I'd love to improve this process." What recommendations do you have for people in finance functions to try to improve that data maturity, but to do it safely so that it's not going to cause a data integrity issue?
yeah. So I think before I get to that, I firmly believe that the way we do finance now is very different from how we were doing 10 years ago. And
Mm,
how we will be doing it 10 years from now is going to be very different. There was uh, a time where we needed a lot of people to be processing transactions, uh, generating records, doing all of these Excel files. And the way that has transformed is been a lot of automation at different points in this whole
mm,
cycle of recording transactions to recording those transactions, then getting the data out of whatever ERP systems or applications you're doing to a central point, and then to start and analyze that data, right? Uh, so those who still feel that you know they need to do this somehow in an Excel like environment, uh, I see an inherent risk in there,
mm,
which is that you it is easy to lose track of who edited what. To say it simply, who edited what, right? There was a point of time where we used to early on in my career rely a lot on sending Excel files with financial numbers, right? uh, and over the past 4 or 5 years we realized that we still leverage Excel, but we leverage Excel for more on the fly simulation analytics, what if kind of scenarios, all of that stuff. But when it comes down to really disseminating information, we've started to move away from Excel a long time ago. And I think
mm,
that is where people need to differentiate that different tools have different purposes. Uh, and for purely analytical purposes, where you have to set up an enterprise level analytical system where people can log in and consume information and then take business decisions, we probably need to look at something which is governed inside the organization so that people cannot edit the numbers in there, people cannot put in their own information in there at the
mm,
layer where information is being consumed. Because once I or you as a user, you log into a system and you can say, I know these numbers that I'm looking at. If I go back to the origin of these numbers in whatever ERP or application system, I'm going to find the same numbers. That's where your trust comes in, which we were talking about previously. That's really really important. Uh, I've been in meetings where we started discussing business performance, and the conversation completely shifted somewhere else to, are these numbers even correct?
mm.
And I think in order to avoid that, you need to be careful how we are managing the data throughout its life cycle, right? Who's touching it? Who is able to create new records? Who is able to edit those records, etc. Right? So I think that's an important point that finance
Yeah.
professionals need to understand.
Yeah. I I think I again like kind of understand where some of that, the movement towards like, hey, like every single question has a model
Yeah,
in Excel and there's a person that owns that model and is responsible for that. I kind of get it because then it's like, all right, well, that employee provides the additional level of support
yeah,
and comfort
yeah,
for the model. Like we can just go ask that person. But you're absolutely right. Like at a certain level of technological advancement that we've just seen happen in the marketplace. There are new tools and new automations. Like Excel is still an incredible tool. I still use it
Yeah.
all the time and I recommend it for a lot of situations, just not all of the situations. And so I thought you brought up a really great point by saying, if you're not at a place where you are making use of some of these additional tools, it's an opportunity to differentiate yourself from other competition and to say, hey, well, if we're doing the same process to generate the same report and it's highly standardized, can I automate some portion of that with the proper documentation? And now it's faster and it's more trustworthy because there's a higher degree of governance. So,
Can I give you can I give you an example of that?
of course, yeah,
So,
that'd be great.
uh, m- uh, when I started with Schneider, I started as a financial analyst, and I inherited a process where on fifth day of the month I had to send out uh, financial performance reports for the top line numbers. So the process that I inherited was that I would get an Excel file. Basically, it was table, orders and sales. I'll have to go through the whole process of uh, doing my analysis. Then the next thing that I would do is build charts out of it. Then I'll paste it in PowerPoint, and I'll send it out. It would typically take 2 days to do this entire process. And then after doing it for, I think, around 4 or 5 months, I said, okay, how can I automate it? And the way I did it is I wrote a custom SQL, used that to bring in data into Tableau, and then uh, build a dashboard out of it, which was similar to what we had in PowerPoint, which we used to send out, and then just published it on a server. And from the next month onwards, all I would need to do is just refresh the data. So instead of sending it 2 days after we had the numbers, I was able to share the results within 5 minutes of us having finalized the numbers.
Wow.
So, and I think that was something that was appreciated a lot by everybody, both inside finance and on the business side as well.
Yeah. Yeah, since we're sharing, you kinda spawned a couple memories for me. So this was actually before I was a consultant, this particular story, but, um, I worked straight out of college, I worked for a telecom company, and that's where I was initially on their FP&A team, and I there were some cool stories of automation there, but, talking about generating financial numbers. So when I was on the FP&A team, they had one job, and I had basically automated that kinda in the exact same fashion as you. I had done it for a little while, and I was like, "Man, there's gotta be a better way," which I think is kind of, a trait of people with the data gene, just that, like, constant thought, like, "There's gotta be a better way." So, naturally, I spent, you know, hours coding to avoid doing hours of work. It's kinda but anyway, so I built this automation and kinda, like, it automated my whole job, and so they were like, "Alright, well, like, what do we do with this kid? He just, like, automated his job. He's, like, fresh out of school. We just hired him." So there were, like, these 2 other people that were doing BI and data work under the finance umbrella, and they were like, "Yeah, just, like, go set him up with them. Like, we'll figure out something smart for him to do." So I went up with these guys, and we start figuring everything out. And so the process that I had, originally targeted on was, like, our ability to close our books at the end of the month. So there were like all of these processes of, okay, well, we have to like go through, generate a bill run, all of those bills get generated as a process of all of that. Like the data gets captured for all of that stuff. And then all of those numbers get input into the system, they get validated, and then they get, aggregated and loaded into the ledgers. And then bang, cool, here we go. Now we can say how much money officially we made. And so this process, same thing, took like a handful of business days, and it was like a big and involved process. And so I remember talking to them and I was like, okay, so where do they get all the information from the bill runs for? Right. And they were like, oh, those are over in these tables. And I was like, well, why don't we just use those tables to close the books? right? Instead of
Yeah.
waiting to generate a bunch of bills and,
You keep going backwards and backwards, and it's like, okay, let me now automate next step and the next step, and you started integrating the whole process end to end.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, and just kinda, like, inching a little bit further back up in the process and sprinkling in, like, little automations and queries and what have you along the way. And you're absolutely right. So we got to a place like obviously like closing the books is very, very important for, the finance function in a large company. It's basically everybody saying like, all right, the numbers are right. So we had to go through a
yeah,
handful of months process of like watching this new process run in parallel with
yeah.
the old process as it tied out. Have we made any mistakes? But, once we got through that whole thing, we were able to take our business process from saying like the books are closed, 5 or 6 business days after the last business day of the month to saying the morning after the last business day of the month, here are your numbers. And they were trustworthy and signed off. It is really, really cool what the possibilities are.
So I want to ask you a question because you do talk to a lot of people, right?
Shoot.
And we're talking about these two areas, finance and data, right? Finance, some people consider it to be like, very, there's certain roots, there's certain fundamentals you cannot change, right? It's a more stable, static environment in finance, and data is this ever changing, rapidly evolving environment with new tools, technologies, ways of thinking. Have you seen that when these two combine, is it like something beautiful comes out all the time? Or do you always like, oh, this is the explosion because the reactions happening here?
Yeah, that's a fun question. I like that. So I think it comes down to kind of the right tool for the right job. And the while the tools that we can use in finance and in anything else from a data perspective, you're right, are rapidly evolving. I think the optimization parameters change much more slowly, if not stay stable. And like this need for a very high degree of fidelity and accuracy within finance is not something that I imagine changing super fast. So, obviously, could I build an entire house with a hammer? Like maybe, but it'd take me a really long time, I wouldn't wanna do it, so I think the biggest thing that I always liked looking for, particularly in finance and in looking for optimizations and automations, is anything clearly defined that happens more than once. And the thing that's really cool about finance is, as you talked about, there is such a high degree of thought and preparation and standardization that goes into things that many times the logic is much more clearly defined in finance than it may be in other areas of the business. So, like another area of the business, right? Like whether something goes into category A or B, maybe an employee's judgment call, right? Whereas, within the books of a publicly traded company, it's like, no, 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 they're like legal standards. This goes here. So I actually think that that plays to the advantage of someone who's trying to find new ways to innovate within finance. We can use that rigor and that structure to be the backbone of automation. So the more clearly defined the requirements are, the easier time a computer has following them without needing human intervention. So when it comes to, doing things like certain categorizations or, certain processes, if they are the same every time and they're repetitive and they follow clean rules, yeah, it absolutely leads to those like beautiful, hey, we cut this time, drastically down, like it is an amazing result. However, on the other side of finance, I think that some of the most critical decisions about how a business's future is going to go happen in the finance department.
Yeah.
Can we afford this? Should we make X investment? What is our expectation of how the market will respond to X, Y, or Z? These are decisions that, you know, I want to try to be a part of informing as best as I can, but really do come down to like human beings opining and using experience and using all the data at their fingertips. And so like there are definitely spaces where I think like that restraint and standardization and human element still belongs.
Yeah, I agree. And the reason why I asked you this question is I come across both type of people, right? I've worked with people. I remember many years ago when I started my career, I was working for an accountant who had fortunately started using computers. But the thing was, I was given a template to build a balance sheet, and if I would change anything, move a font, change the width of a column, it was like I would send right back to do it exactly in the way I was given. It was so rigid. The environment was so rigid. I could not
Yeah.
change anything. And on the flip side, I've also seen uh, leaders who come in and say, "Okay, give me a new way of doing it. What's the other way of looking at the same information? Can we do it differently? Can we find more automated way of doing it, or can we find an easier way of doing it or explaining this problem?" So I think that's why I asked that question, just to see, if you have also had both kind of experiences.
Yeah. I think, one of the other things that you mentioned when I was asking a little bit about, socks and high fidelity and how to balance that with speed, you had talked about there being a big difference between finance reports that are like going out to the SEC and like traders and all that stuff, and then reports that maybe we're using internally to describe the financial performance of the company or some financial, modeling that we have for the future, whatever the case may be. And on the compliance side and like external reporting side, I tend to say, okay, like that's the place for the rigidity.
Yeah.
That like it is what it is. There's government regulations. We want clarity. We want simplicity, all of that stuff. The internal place, that's where you start, at least in my opinion, to have a lot of opportunities for fun. And I personally have found that, as I mentioned, finance professionals kind of naturally have to have that data gene. And many times, because of the rigor that's required for external reporting, and because that's just kind of a standard of finance, that tends to kind of permeate the culture. And so when you can show them like fun new ways of looking at data that drive into insights and start looking at them in different ways, it really can electrify a team. So for example, like we're talking about like a standard, you generate some financial reporting, right? Your standard financial report. So your balance sheet, your profit and loss. One of the most common things, as you know, but for the listeners, that people will do is they'll start looking at like ratios between some of these numbers. So, maybe I look at current assets versus current liabilities, and I'm trying to get a handle on like, hey, okay, well, like, what's my ability to pay my
Mm.
bills? And so this is actually a really interesting number. What if I generated a line chart on like a transaction daily basis that looks at the volatility of that? Like, can I see, is that trending upwards and then spiking downwards? And there's all sorts of fun stuff. Or another thing that I really like doing is combining some of the financial information that you have with other areas of the business. So obviously, dollars are a huge part of every part of the business. But when you start combining, looking at marketing and sales, and then looking at some of, more traditional finance functions, like looking at finance, from a larger perspective, including, accounts payable, accounts receivable, some of that stuff. Okay, cool. Well, now we can build really, really cool reporting on, cash conversion cycle and, cost of customer acquisition, and comparing that. You can start building all of these like really, really impactful high level reports that come directly from that financial information that are still like extremely impactful. You can be extremely agile and fast with them.
Uh, that is true, and the more type of data we bring in and we put it in a one place,
Mm,
and we start we start looking at the cross section of different types of data point, we suddenly start seeing patterns emerge, right? And I do believe that in a lot of organizations now, you have these teams which are specifically being set to go out and do these kind of explorations, right? To, okay, come up with a hypothesis, get the data, see if that hypothesis is true or not, and what does it mean, right, for the organization? What kind of decisions can be taken based on that? Also, at the same time, something that people should keep in mind, do keep in mind, is correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation, right? Uh, so that is also an important part. Uh, Another thing about the finance organization and people who work in finance deal with data day in day out, but I think something that is more prominent in finance organizations is the attention to detail. So people are more
Mm.
detail oriented, uh, and we want to be more precise when we are dealing with numbers. So I think that is one area which is quite unique to finance world.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's a good fit. Now, one of the things, if I can circle back just a little bit, that you had mentioned as we were talking about certain ways that an organization, right, you kind of thrown down the gauntlet and said, this is a way for finance functions or companies to differentiate themselves is to kind of make some of these investments. And one of the things that you had mentioned was a data warehouse, which is obviously something that, I know quite a bit about and that we've talked a lot on the podcast about in different levels of depth and from different perspectives. But from a financial perspective, what are some recommendations that you could provide to people? Because in general, a finance function may understand the concept of like, okay, cool, we're going to like go build a database. It'll have some stuff in it. I'm just going here instead of some other system. What recommendation can you make for finance leaders to like really understand the value of what it is that they're investing in when they try to build something like a data warehouse? And how should they go about it?
Uh, two things there that I would say to keep it simple. There are like so many things, but to keep it simple, the first thing is think of the entire life cycle of data, not just at one point, not at the point of creation, not at the time of managing it or consuming it. Think of it
Mm,
across the entire life cycle, and for that, it I would recommend the organization to choose one benchmark for data maturity, do a baseline assessment, and then work towards, okay, what are some of the things that we can do to improve on this cycle of being more data centric, being more mature with how we manage, handle our data. That is one thing. The the second thing that I would say is a lot of the problems can be overcome if we focus on ensuring that the data quality at the time we are capturing it is correct. Let me give you an example. Uh, uh, let's say that there's a company out there, GE Healthcare or Philips Healthcare. Let's say Philips Healthcare. You have 200 offices, and anybody can go in and create a record. Somebody would say Philips Healthcare, somebody can write it PH, or somebody can write Philips HC, Philips H Care, etc. And then eventually down the road, if you have to do a simple thing as how much business did we do with this customer, is going to become really really difficult, right? So that's
mhm.
that's uh that's what I would say. And maybe I'm biased here because I feel like, you know uh, in the eventual consumption of data in the analytics function, we see a lot of challenges arrive because of not having good data in the first place, right? And that is
Yeah.
where we started also our conversation today. What do you say about having the right data for a particular decision? So I think having that broad perspective of data maturity across the life cycle of data is really really important. And then having a secondary focus in implementing quality at each step of the way is going to be the two things which I think are really, really important to begin with
Yeah.
on a journey. But as you go along, there like each part of the journey, there's so many things which can be improved.
Talk about full circle.
Yeah.
What a slam dunk. I don't
Mhm.
think we can improve on an
Yeah.
ending for that. So what I'd love to do is I want to pivot and talk a little bit about you.
Yeah.
I like giving everybody a chance to get to know who's, on the other
Yeah.
side of the mic and get a little chance to know you a little bit. So tell me a little bit about you. What do you like to do outside of work? What's your life like? What makes you tick?
Sorry, you cut off for me a little bit. Trying.
Oh, sure. No problem. We'll try that again. So basically, I love to make sure that everybody gets to know the person on the other side of the mic a little bit. So tell us a little bit about what you like to do outside of work, what makes you happy, hobbies, fun, anything like that. Tell us a little bit so we can get a picture into who you are.
Oh, sure. What makes me happy is learning something new. So a few days ago, I think 2 weeks ago, me and my son, he's 11-year-old, we played our first game of golf ever. It was my first game of golf, his first game of golf as well, and we totally enjoyed it. And ever since then, I've started learning a little bit more about the game, how do you play it, and getting into it. So at any given point of time, I'm always looking forward to learning something new. Um, I'm also very interested in, investing and just in general learning about different businesses. Uh, and also, I think we share another passion, which is flying. So, been learning to fly, working towards my private pilot license for a couple of years now.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of shared passions. Um, I will tell you is so I grew up golfing. I took a long time off, and then maybe a year and a half, 2 years ago, I started getting back into golfing. It's a cruel game full of disappointment that I just can't put down. I love it too much. Golf is a humbling, humbling game. I'll tell you that. Now, in case anybody wants to reach out to you or wants to connect with you, what's the best way to get in touch?
The best way to get in touch with me is through LinkedIn. I typically respond back to people within like a day or two after I receive a message. Uh, I'm not always able to help, but I do my best based on whatever I can. Uh, I love uh, I love connecting uh, with people, especially in the early career or mid career phase, because I think I've gone through that journey, and I love to share and I love to help if I can. Also, since I've moved many countries. I was born and raised in India, and then I moved to Canada. I lived there for 7, 8 years, and then I moved to US. So I've also seen how moving countries can impact your life and your career. And I've also volunteered with a couple of organizations who work with new immigrants to help them settle in a new country. So the best way to reach me is on LinkedIn.
That's awesome. I love it, and I love hearing about the volunteer work. That's something that I'm a big believer in as well. Trying to give back where it makes sense. Actually, to that end, this past weekend I rode in the Pan Mass Challenge, which is a 186-mile bike ride across most of Massachusetts to fundraise for the Dana Farber Cancer Institute. So we'll put a link to donate to that. And Divya, if you want to follow suit, if you want to send us a link to any charity that you want, we'll be happy to throw that up. But if you're interested in sponsoring, volunteering, donating, anything, 100% of the money goes to the Dana Farber Cancer Institute. So check out that link in the show notes. I got to thank you so much. You were such an incredible guest. In fact, I think you have the distinct honor of being the first guest who has asked me a question, which I absolutely loved. It was such a good one as well. It got me super excited talking about all sorts of random financial metrics. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your time. with us, Divya. It was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me on the podcast, Ryan. It was a pleasure talking to you. You made it far easier than I thought it would be.
I'm happy to hear that.
It's a good conversation. A lot of people who have tried it may know that as soon as you're the best speaker in the world, but as soon as the camera turns on, you get tongue tied.
Yeah.
So
It's all an act. I'm right there with you, man. It's just because I've gotten some reps. But to all of the listeners, especially if you've made it this far, I want to thank you guys so much for listening. If you learned something today, or you laughed, or you liked something, please make sure to tell a friend, or subscribe, write us a review, hopefully a good one. All that stuff helps keep the podcast moving. So we'd really appreciate it if you can do that. Divya, thank you again once more. And this has been another exciting episode of the Making Better Decisions podcast. Thanks for listening. That's a wrap for today's episode of Making Better Decisions. For show notes and more, visit makingbetterdecisions.live. A special thank you to our sponsor, Canopy Analytic. Canopy Analytic is a boutique consultancy focused on business intelligence and data engineering. They help companies make better decisions using data. For more information, visit canopyanalytic.com. There's a better way. Let's find it together and make better decisions. Thank you so much for listening. We'll catch you next week. Peace.